On the morning of September 27, 1942, the SS Stephen Hopkins was alone in the South Atlantic, moving steadily westward after leaving Cape Town 8 days earlier. She was heading towards Suriname, where she was expected to take on a cargo of bauxite for the long trip back across the Atlantic. There was nothing unusual about the voyage. In wartime, that was often the best a merchant crew could hope for. The Stephen Hopkins was a Liberty ship, one of the new American cargo vessels being turned out in astonishing numbers after the United States entered the war. They were not elegant ships, and nobody pretended they were. Their purpose was not beauty. Their purpose was quantity. They had to be simple enough to build quickly, sturdy enough to cross an ocean, and roomy enough to carry whatever the war required. By the spring of 1942, these ships had become as important to the Allied cause as tanks, bombers, and destroyers, because all of those things still had to be moved by sea. The Hopkins had been delivered only a few months earlier, in May of 1942, and had already made one cargo run to South Africa. Like many merchant ships sailing dangerous waters, she carried a small naval armed guard detachment to man her defensive guns. Those weapons were modest: a 4-inch gun mounted aft, a pair of smaller anti-aircraft pieces, and machine guns. They were there to discourage submarines or make a raider think twice, not to fight a sustained surface action against a heavily armed enemy ship. Nobody aboard would have mistaken the Hopkins for a warship. She was a cargo vessel with a job to do, and that job was to keep moving. Her master was Captain Paul Buck, an experienced merchant mariner from Georgia. The men under him were merchant seamen, naval gunners, and a few cadets learning the trade at sea while the world was at war. One of those cadets was Edwin Joseph O'Hara, a teenager from the Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point. He was still very near the beginning of his life. Like thousands of young Americans in those years, he had gone into wartime service before he had really had time to imagine what adulthood might look like. At about 9:30 that morning, shapes began to emerge through the haze. 2 vessels were nearby, much closer than anyone liked, and there was very little time to decide what they were. One of them was the German commerce raider Stier. The other was her supply ship, Tannenfels. The morning fog had worked both ways. The Germans had not seen the Hopkins until she was already too close, and the Hopkins had no warning until the danger was practically on top of her. The Stier was not a Navy cruiser in the usual sense, but she was far more dangerous than the Hopkins had any right to face. Originally a merchant vessel herself, she had been converted into an armed raider and sent into the Atlantic to hunt Allied commerce. Her guns were concealed until needed. Her mission was straightforward: find merchant shipping, stop it, and destroy it. By the time she encountered the Hopkins, she had already sent several Allied ships to the bottom. She carried heavier guns, more men, and every advantage that mattered in a fight of this kind. In most such encounters, the outcome was decided before the first serious shot was fired. A lone merchant ship, lightly armed and unsupported, did not stand off against an enemy raider. It stopped. Its crew abandoned ship if ordered. The Germans took prisoners if it suited them, and then the merchantman was sunk. It was brutal, but it was also practical. A cargo ship did not exist to duel with a raider in the middle of the ocean. Every man on either side knew that. Captain Buck chose to fight. There is no need to decorate that decision with rhetoric. It was what it was. A deliberate choice made by a professional seaman who understood his circumstances perfectly well. He knew the Hopkins could not outrun the raider. He knew what the 4-inch gun could do and what it could not do. He also knew that surrender was not the only option available to him, and he acted accordingly. The Stier opened fire, and the Hopkins was hit almost at once. One of the first shells severely wounded Lieutenant, junior grade, Kenneth Willett, the officer commanding the armed guard. The raider's gunfire did more than tear up steel. It damaged the ship's boilers and left the Hopkins dead in the water. A burning cargo ship now unable to maneuver while 2 enemy vessels worked in close. Tannenfels joined in with machine gun fire. Under those conditions, Many crews would have focused only on getting clear while they still could. The men at the stern gun of the Stephen Hopkins stayed at their post and answered back. That is the heart of the story. Not because it is dramatic, though it certainly was, but because it runs against every expectation that shaped commerce warfare in those years. The Germans expected another frightened merchant crew. Instead, they found a ship whose people were willing to stand and return fire against overwhelming odds. The Hopkins aft gun began landing hits, not only on the Stier but on Tannenfels as well. A cargo vessel that should have been finished in minutes was now firing accurately enough to cause serious damage. As the fight continued, the Hopkins took punishment from stem to stern. Shells ripped through the superstructure. Fire spread. Men were killed where they stood. Willett, though badly wounded, stayed with the gun crew as long as he could. At some point, the 4-inch gun's crew was reduced until almost nobody remained. The air around the stern was full of smoke, fragments, and the bitter reek of burning paint and explosives. It was the sort of close, violent action that leaves very little room for abstraction afterward. For the men involved, there was no grand strategy in those moments. There was only the next shell, the next order, the next few feet of deck. Edwin O'Hara made his way aft to help at the gun. According to later accounts, Willett was too weak by then to load the weapon alone. Together, they managed to fire 5 more rounds before the magazine below them blew and flames shot up the hoist. That detail matters because it strips the story down to its essentials. By then, the ship was already lost. There was no realistic prospect of saving her, yet the gun was still firing. That is why the Stier continued to suffer damage long after she would have expected the fight to be over. Captain Buck eventually gave the order to abandon ship. The Hopkins was burning fiercely and settling. O'Hara and Willett did not survive. Both were later reported killed by machine gun fire while trying to release life rafts as the end came. Captain Buck was also dead. So were many others. The Hopkins went down carrying with her much of the evidence of what had happened on her decks that morning, but not all of it, because enough men survived to tell the story. By the time the Stephen Hopkins sank, the Stier was in desperate trouble herself. Fire had taken hold aboard the raider, and the damage was beyond control. She managed to transfer her crew and prisoners to Tannenfels, but she could not be saved. Shortly afterward, she went down as well. In practical terms, the outcome was extraordinary. A Liberty ship, one of the plain cargo carriers that had become the workhorses of the Allied war effort, had fought a German surface raider to destruction. It remains one of the most remarkable actions in the history of the American merchant marine. Officially, the Stephen Hopkins became the only American merchant vessel to sink a German surface combatant during the war. 19 men from the Hopkins made it into a lifeboat. That was not the end of their ordeal. In some ways, it was the beginning of another one. They were deep in the South Atlantic with limited provisions, no certainty of rescue, and a boat that had never been intended for a voyage of any length. They improvised a sail and turned toward Brazil. The distances involved were immense. Days became weeks. Saltwater and exposure wore them down. Rations had to be measured carefully, and even careful measures were often not enough. Men weakened. Some died. When the survivors finally reached the Brazilian coast on October 27th, after 31 days at sea, only 15 were still alive. By then, the battle itself must have seemed both immediate and impossibly distant. One concentrated burst of noise and fire, followed by a month of exhaustion and thirst. The survivors' statements were gathered and compared, and in time, German records confirmed what must have seemed almost unbelievable when first reported. The Stephen Hopkins had indeed mortally damaged the Stier before she herself was sunk. The decorations came later, as they often do. Captain Buck and Edwin O'Hara received the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal posthumously. Kenneth Willett received the Navy Cross. The ship herself was later honored with the Gallant Ship Award. Those recognitions were deserved, though they say only so much. Medals and citations can preserve a name, but they cannot fully restore the reality of an event like this. The reality lived in the choices made on that deck by men who had no guarantee that anyone would remember what they had done. There is another reason the story has lasted. It says something important about the merchant marine in the Second World War, a service that spent decades in the shadows of more visible branches. Merchant seamen were not usually celebrated the way fighter pilots or submarine commanders were celebrated. Their work was repetitive, dangerous, and often anonymous. Yet nothing moved without them. Ammunition, fuel, food, trucks, aircraft parts, medical supplies, all of it had to cross oceans before it could matter. The war was won in part by factories, and in part by armies. But it was also won by ships like the Stephen Hopkins, and by the men who sailed them. That is what makes this episode linger in memory. Not simply the rarity of the action, though it was rare. Not simply the courage involved, though there was certainly courage. It lingers because it reveals, with unusual clarity, what total war asked of ordinary working people. The Stephen Hopkins was not a famous vessel with a celebrated captain and a hand-picked fighting crew. She was a cargo ship on a routine passage. The people aboard were doing necessary work, much of it unglamorous, far from headlines and cameras. Then history came over the horizon in the form of a German raider, and those same people were suddenly left to answer a question that had not been put to them when they signed on. The answer they gave was simple enough. They fought. Not elegantly, not theatrically, and not in the manner later retellings sometimes prefer. They fought as working seamen and wounded gunners, and a young cadet fought when there was no good outcome left to choose from. They kept serving the gun. They kept trying to get life rafts free. They kept the ship in action for as long as the ship remained afloat. The result was that the Stier did not sail away from the encounter. She went down too. The wreck of the Stephen Hopkins has never been found. Neither, with certainty, has the wreck of the Stier. Somewhere in the South Atlantic, the two ships still lie in the same broad emptiness where they met in the fog that morning. That seems fitting in a way. The Atlantic keeps many of its stories at depth. What remains to us are the records, the testimony of survivors, and a handful of names that should not be lost. Paul Buck, Kenneth Willett, Edwin O'Hara. Those names belong not only to one ship and one action, but to a larger history that was easy to overlook once the war was over. For a long time, the merchant marine itself was overlooked. Recognition came late. Memory came unevenly. But some stories do survive, and this one survived because it was too unusual and too honest to disappear entirely. A plain American cargo ship met a German raider in open water and refused to submit. The cargo ship sank. The raider sank. The survivors drifted for a month before land finally rose for them off Brazil. Stripped of embellishment, that is the story. It does not need much help from a narrator. If you value these quieter corners of history, where the people involved were not famous and the results still mattered, you can subscribe at the end of this video. And if your family had someone in the Merchant Marine or the Armed Guard, feel free to leave the name below. Those names deserve a place in the record too.